One of the things that we start to hear about, start thinking about, start listening to, start looking at a lot of the ads, a lot of the news that's out there is that somehow we can get weight loss all in a little pill. Whether it's the Zepbound that we see in all the commercials, whether it's the Ozempic, whether it's the Hims or Hers or Roe, compound semaglutide, all this idea that somehow we can achieve weight loss simply by taking a pill where we don't have to worry about nutrition, where we don't have to worry about any of the other things that we talk about when it comes to the issues surrounding weight loss. Which leads to the question, how is this supposed to work? Why does it not always work? And is it worth all the hype? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning: the following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
So we've previously looked at and discussed exercise and weight loss, and do we have a pill for that? And why do those pills not always work? Where we looked at the idea about exercise mimics. Those are the drugs or the supplements that are supposed to somehow give us the same physiological benefits that we get from doing exercise. Whether it is activation on the ERR pathway, whether it's activation on the PPAR pathways, whether it is utilizing an AMPK agonist to regulate energy balance and regulate nutrient balance, whether it is GLP-1 agonists like what we see with the semaglutamides that are going to somehow regulate various metabolic and various psychological issues that come about in terms of diet and exercise and the ability to have a manipulation in weight coming about from these GLP-1 agonists. Whether it's an anorexic or an anorexic regulator, those are pharmaceuticals, drugs, supplements that are going to regulate when do I not feel hungry versus when do I feel hungry. And part of that comes into the idea with these GLP-1 agonists. The assumption that's being made where we start looking at all of the various benefits that come about from the mimics is that we are somehow preventing diseases that are associated with body weight issues. Things like glucose homeostasis, things like energy balance issues, things like mitochondrial functions and or dysfunctions, depending on how you want to look at it. Things like lipid utilization, where the assumption here is that we're going to be increasing the utilization of lipids for fuel in order to achieve the energy balance that we're not going to get from dietary restrictions. That we're going to somehow change lipid utilization that's going to change mitochondrial functions. That we're going to somehow change lipid utilization that's going to somehow cause a change in our glucose homeostasis, where everything is related to the fact that we are assuming that weight issues is automatically going to be a precursor for metabolic issues. One of the kind of diagnostic criteria that we have to look at when we start looking at this prescription for the GLP-1 agonists, the Ozempic, the Wegovy, the semaglutide compound drugs, is a BMI score that puts me into an overweight or obese categorization, where all of the assumed benefits besides weight loss is that I am no longer overweight. When we start looking at some of the mimic criteria in terms of what they're going to be doing physiologically and metabolically, is that they're going to be changing the way in which we are going to be metabolizing a lot of the fuel sources that we have that's going to make us a more efficient system, a more efficient organism, have a body that's more efficient in terms of utilizing the fuel sources that's going to reduce the reactive oxidative species. And by reducing reactive oxidative species is going to make me even more efficient in terms of how I go about utilizing the fuel sources. The other thing that we look at when we start looking at the exercise mimics, once again, we've gone more into more depth with the previous talk, is we are going to somehow increase the mitochondrial respiration rates. Not only are we going to increase the mitochondrial respiration rates, the way the metabolism is taking place within the mitochondria, but we're going to make the individual more aerobically fit, all from these mimics. Now, if we start looking at the ideas as relates to a lot of the semaglutamides, the Zepbounds, and those factors, is that it's about changing body composition through the use of the medication, by changing body weight through use of the medication, without any of the other factors that come into play as relates to changing of body mass, where somehow we're going to regulate the eating behaviors, that we're going to somehow modify when we are hungry, when we are full, and be able to stop ourselves from eating or overeating in certain cases. And this all goes into some of the ideas that relates to why are people overweight. And this goes into one of the misconceptions out there as relates to the calorie issue, where everyone wants to talk about caloric balance equals weight balance, where if I have so many calories in the foods I'm eating and I'm expending so many calories in all of the activities I'm doing, somehow I'm going to either gain weight or lose weight. The problem here is that how much does a calorie actually weigh? And calories are weightless units of energy. And so the idea that we want to surround this whole entire conversation around food intake as relates to calories and caloric balance means that we're missing the key components of the ideas as it relates to weight balance, as it relates to the idea about homeostasis, as it relates to the idea about overall health and body composition. And it's an and, it's not a cause. The use of calories as an end all in the conversation is a misconception. Not only is it a misconception, it's a misnomer. Not only is it a misconception, misnomer, it can actually lead to misinformation and disinformation. And part of the reason is because the BMR calculations, the actual estimates that are being used, are biased against populations. That's because the people that were used to establish these calculations were white, European, active, and male. And so if I don't fit into those categories, the equations that I'm using are going to be highly skewed against me. While a lot of people want to talk about this in terms of the caloric balance issue, the real idea here is the feeding regulation issue. And the feeding regulation issue is all about hormonal swings that come about due to either feeling hungry or feeling full, where we have these changes coming into play in terms of the serotonergic pathway and the dopaminergic pathway that are either going to drive me to want to eat or stop me from eating. All of this is going to lead to changes that we see hormonally, where we have this exquisite feedback regulation coming into play in between the satiated loop and the full loop, where we see the same hormones coming into play that are going in opposite directions, that are going to have antagonistic effects within the hypothalamus and within the cerebral cortex within our brain, changing the dopaminergic pathway, DOPA, and the serotonergic pathway that's going to either lead me to start eating or to stop eating. That is all linked in with various types of reward centers, driving me to either want to get food or changing the outward energetic pathways that we have within the body that's going to stop me from wanting to get more food. All of this comes into play with hormones such as GLPs, such as GIPs, such as leptin, such as ghrelin, such as insulin, such as glucagon, such as cortisol, oxyntomodulin. All of those are coming into play. But the other thing comes into play that most of the drugs and most of the pharmaceuticals and a lot of the other avenues of support look at do not address, which is the endocannabinoidal system, which is going to be one of the major regulators within the body as it comes into the anorexic, anorexic regulators in terms of, do I want to start eating or can I stop eating? And so one of the things that's coming to play when we start looking at this idea about the GLP agonists is that we're trying to modulate that signal for having high GLP and having high GLP triggering the anorexic response and blunting the orexic response. When we start looking at the data that's out there as it relates to the various types of pharmaceutical agents, when we start looking at the overall rate of weight loss, almost every one of them indicates that the drug is significantly greater than the placebo effect as it relates to weight loss over a short period of time, and in some cases over a long period of time, where we see a difference ranging from, on average, 7 kilograms to as little as 2 kilograms. And that is over an extended period of time, much longer than what most people are willing to psychologically put themselves through for weight loss, where very early on, as we see here in the graph from Mancini, we do not see very large changes in total mass loss over the first 4 to 6 weeks. And that's simply because when we first start out doing anything, every person is going to see drastic changes in their weight and in the other physiological measures that we're looking at. And so we know that calorie in, calorie out is not going to be the end all be all. It's about nutrient balance. More on that in a little bit. And the nutrient balance is going to impact my basal metabolic rate. But there's other things that are going to come into play besides just nutrient balance, besides just calorie in, calorie out. It's about the hormone signals that come into play. And it's not about that thyroid hormone that we keep harping on or keep hearing about in terms of my metabolic rate. There's not a single hormone that we look at that's going to be the end all be all cause for changes. We're going to see hormones like testosterone, hormones like growth hormone, hormones like cortisol that are all going to come into play that's going to have this impact. And so if we start looking at the way in which the hormones change and the way in which the various types of stresses that we're going to use to cause weight loss come into play, one of the things we start looking at is favorability of the various types of modes of activity relative to diet alone, because we have to somehow figure out if it's not the calorie thing, it has to be something else, the hormones. And so one of the things that we start looking at is what happens in terms of the effectiveness as we start going further and further out. Because once again, the short term changes that we see will be seen across all types of interventions. One of the things that we start looking at in terms of effectiveness is that as we start to map out, as we start to progress out into the 8 to 12 to 14 to 16 week period of time, we start seeing a plateau effect in terms of weight loss and favorability of treatments that we see for exercise relative to diet or for diet itself. One of the things that we start looking at in terms of favorability, in terms of this idea about diet and exercise, is that exercise tends to be more favorable for weight loss, not only more favorable for weight loss, but is preferential for retaining the fat-free mass while losing the fat mass. And this is where we get into this idea about recompositioning of the body, that is changing the body composition, not necessarily losing weight, which is one of the things that gets lost when we start looking at a lot of those curves, a lot of those graphs that deal with what happens to the body based off of weight loss, just weight loss itself over the period of time. The other thing that we want to look at is what happens in terms of effectiveness as relates to utilizing dietary supplements or utilizing the pharmacological agents, where we do not see a favorability that is going to always line up to favoring the use of all of these various supplements, all of these various weight loss pills relative to just doing diet or exercise or a combination of diet and exercise for any of the measurements within the body mass, for any of the measurements within fat mass, or for any of the measurements within fat-free mass, where we actually see a greater benefit for maintaining fat-free mass when we do not utilize those various drugs, those various supplements. And part of this has to deal with what are the various factors that come into play here in terms of those hormonal responses to exercise that's going to allow me to maintain the mass that I want to maintain. And so even though we're looking at these curves and say, oh, we look at this and we see these great weight loss measurements, we see these drastic weight loss measurements. When we start looking at this prolonged studies, where we start seeing the semaglutide studies, where we start seeing at higher dosage, we see greater rates of change, we see greater total mass loss over that time frame. But what happens when we stop the pharmacological treatment? We see a greater rebound following the stopping of the pharmacological treatment than we see from just doing the diet and exercise alone. And part of this goes into what's happening physiologically and what's happening hormonally in response to changes that we see from taking the drugs versus not taking the drugs. And so how should it work? It should work by triggering distinct anorexic responses that's going to reduce my desire to eat, that's going to reduce my food intake, that's going to put me into a negative nutrient balance. And by putting myself into a negative nutrient balance, it should allow me to lose weight. But just losing weight by itself isn't the end all be all because not all body mass is the same. And because not all body mass is the same, looking at these graphs and saying, "Oh, this is amazing. We're getting more than 20% of a body mass change." But if I'm not losing the appropriate mass within that 20%, I may not actually be getting the benefit physiologically and the benefit health-wise from those changes that we see. And that's all based off of the fact that things are happening at the cells to develop the responses that we have, particularly when we look at what happens when I stop the treatment. And most of this has to deal with three things. Tolerance is one of them. The other thing that comes into play is the idea about the SAID principle, the specific adaptations to imposed demands, which is where if we do not change what's taking place over time, the effect that we see is going to start to drop. Part of this is dealing with the tolerance issue. Part of this is dealing with the regulatory issue at the receptors on the cells. Part of this is the fact that the body gets used to the stresses that we place on it. And because it gets used to the stresses that we place on it, it stops responding the way it responded early. So once again, look at those early curves. In those early curves, we see very little difference in between the drug groups and the non-drug groups. And because we don't see a lot of change, we can stipulate that there's no benefit coming from the drug. So if we allow this to continue out, we start seeing benefits. But the problem is that psychologically, if I'm being told this is going to help me lose weight, but I'm not seeing the weight loss, I'm going to stop doing it. The other thing we have to look at is dependence issues that come into play, and the fact that we may become physiologically dependent upon those drugs based off of normal feedback regulation, reducing the normal natural occurrence of hormones and normal natural occurrence of responses to hormones within the body without those drugs being present. And so we start looking at this idea in terms of those modifications. The first modification we start looking at is at the receptor, where we start looking at what's referred to as downregulation of receptors. This is where what's happening at the cell is not matching what's happening at the rest of the body. And because those stresses do not match, the cell is going to start to modulate how many receptors it's going to use and its overall responsiveness to the signals for the body stress. And so what this is going to do is this is going to minimize the effectiveness that that drug has over the long term. That adaptation is going to reduce the response that we see. The other types of things that we might see is we might see a change in terms of upregulation of receptors that may work in favor of the drug, but may work antagonistically to the drug. And so what upregulation is doing is it's triggering more receptors for the hormones to become present within the cell in a means to negate or to eliminate the stresses that the cell is facing and the hormones that can help that cell in terms of turning on and turning off various metabolic pathways to eliminate that stress. This is something that we see when we start looking at not getting the same response that we see to a drug, but increase in the drug dosage, and we start seeing the same response. Something very similar to what we get on an everyday basis when we start looking at caffeine consumption. The problem with this upregulation is that if it is upregulating to the antagonist, then what ends up happening is that we may end up reaching toxic levels for the supplement or toxic levels for the drug that we're taking that can cause adverse effects to come into play. The other thing that comes into play, and this is one of the things that we start looking at in terms of one of the hypotheses as it goes into the non-communicable diseases, is that we have different stresses taking place. We have a body stress and we have a cell stress. And they don't agree with each other. And the cell stress not agreeing with the body stress inhibits the hormone's receptor from activating, which inhibits the hormone action from taking place. This is what happens when we start looking at insulin insensitivity or insulin resistance. This is what happens when we start looking at leptin insensitivity or leptin resistance for people who are over fat that lead to this cellular overload that leads to cellular stresses to take place that increases overall oxidative stress, that increases inflammation. And this is where the non-communicable disease sets in. And that non-communicable disease leads to the higher levels of circular levels of hormones, which is where, if you look back at that feedback loop, we looked at the feeding issues, we may see changes in leptin, we may see changes in insulin, but we may not. And that all depends upon how well are the cells, particularly the cells within the cerebral cortex, listening to those signals as relates to, do I need food or do I not need food? Now, one of the things that we start seeing in terms of these GLP agonists and GLP-1 receptor agonists is that we start seeing other things come into play besides just benefits from weight loss. And this is where we start looking at, okay, what other things can we get besides this regulation on feeding? And we start seeing all these other things that come into play where we start seeing responses that go beyond just glucose homeostasis, that go beyond just feeding regulation. And that's because the GLP-1 receptors and the GLP-1 activators is going to change the way in which we get metabolism taking place. And the change in metabolism that we see taking place is going to lead to a normalization of metabolic functions. And by normalizing metabolic functions, it reduces oxidative stress. And by reducing oxidative stress, it minimizes the metabolic disease issues, the metabolic dysregulation issues, the anabolic dysregulation issues that come into play as relates to the non-communicable diseases. The improvements that we see in terms of Parkinson's issues, the improvements that we see in terms of addictive behaviors, the improvements that we see in terms of diabetic conditions, the improvements that we see in terms of cancer risks, the improvements that we see in terms of dementia and neurodegenerative disease from these GLP-1 agonists come about not because of what is taking place from the food intake side of it. It's not coming about due to the change that we see in body weight. It's coming about due to changes that come about due to the body starting to metabolize the tissues of the body in order to meet its nutrient demands. The reason why we lose weight is because of the need to get our nutrient balance back to balance. If I am not consuming enough nutrients to meet the nutrient balance necessary, I'm going to start to break down the stores that I have for those nutrients. The problem is that I cannot pick and choose which stores I'm going to pick and choose from. The hormones are going to do that. And because the hormones are going to do that, it's going to pick and choose everywhere. We cannot say I'm going to simply go ahead and reduce fat mass by taking these GLP-1 agonists and by reducing my food intake. Yes, we may lose fat, but we're also going to lose other things. And that's why when we start looking at this idea about how to do the diet and exercise as relates to consuming these GLP-1 agonists, is that we have to make sure that exercise is a component of the treatment plan. And the reason why we need to be the component of the treatment plan is because we need to change the hormone signaling so that we do not lose excessive amounts of fat-free mass, skeletal muscle, skeleton, but we lose a lot of the fat mass. This is also where we have to look at my nutrient intake, where I'm going to need to skew. I'm going to have to change my nutrient intake and my nutrient load to increase the amount of amino acids, the amount of proteins that are being consumed, so that I have a conservation signal on the breakdown of those fat-free masses so that when I do lose mass, I'm losing the mass that I want to lose. And this is where we start looking at the continuum of fitness and fatness and how the GLP-1 agonists might be able to assist us in terms of this continuum. So we start looking at, okay, why are we getting all these metabolic benefits coming from the GLP-1 agonist? What the GLP-1 agonists are doing is it's helping out with reduction in the fat mass. That's helping out within this continuum of fitness and fatness. That doesn't necessarily mean that the high activity issues or the low activity issues are going to be at play when we start looking at any of the non-communicable diseases, any of the metabolic diseases, any of the metabolic syndrome. The loss of fat mass and the loss of mass in general, coming away from the use of the GLP-1 agonist, will reduce the relative risk for disease because it's reducing the overall fatness factors. The overall factors that are leading to greater amounts of inflammation within the body, greater amounts of reactive oxidative species, greater amounts of oxidative stress that takes place within the body. And by reducing those fatness factors, we're reducing the relative risk for disease. It's not the equivalent that we see from becoming more active. It's simply the reduction in the fat mass because we're reducing all masses within the body. And so, what are some of the factors that are going to come in that are going to be influential? We have physiological factors, we have physical stress, we have nutrition balance, we have genetic regulators, and we have environmental influences that are all going to come together to coalesce in terms of this very complex interaction of cogwheels that are going to impact my health behaviors and my body morphology. And by impacting my health behaviors and my body morphology is going to impact my overall health. What the pharmacological agents are attempting to do is simply focus on that one avenue of hormonal influence on the physiological factors without changes to the environmental influence, the familial influence, the social factors, or the genetic influences that we have. We're not going to see changes in body morphology or changes in overall health behaviors that will lead to overall improvements in health for the long term. And that's the key here, for the long term. Why do we see the rebounding effect once the medicines stopped? Because all we did was look at that one change in the hormonal influence. If we did not utilize a health lifestyle that was selective towards the person who wanted to do it, we're not going to see changes for the benefit of the individual. So, what can we say? Are we going to see benefits? Do we get exercise in a pill? And so this is where we start looking at this idea about the fitness and fatness continuum and the fact that the GLP-1 agonists are going to help us out. Where within this continuum, we have this ever increasing level of fitness relative to an ever increasing level of fatness based off of hormonal signals that's going to lead to either an increase or a decrease in the relative risk for disease based off of the comparison between fatness and fitness factors, where the fatness factors are going to lead to increasing amounts of oxidative stress, increasing amounts of mitochondrial dysregulation, increasing amounts of anabolic dysregulation that leads to ever increasing levels of inflammation and an increased risk for non-communicable and metabolic diseases. What the GLP-1 agonists are doing is that they're reducing mass total. And by reducing mass total, they're also reducing fat mass by having secondary changes taking place that are reducing the level of oxidative stress. They are mimicking what can take place if I happen to become more active within the drug itself. But we do not see the same lifestyle behavioral modifications that will allow for this to become a sustainable improvement in that fitness and fatness continuum. Inside this fitness and fatness continuum, we will see changes take place to make me more fit, to reduce my relative risk for disease, independent of changes in body composition, which is where we have to remember the scale is just the scale. Tell me how much weight happens to be there. The whole idea in terms of is my body weight going to cause disease issues is off of this continuum of fitness and fatness, not necessarily how fat I happen to be, not necessarily how obese my BMI happens to tell me, but what is the relative relationship between the fitness factors and the fatness factors. And so, what are some of these factors of influence? What are some of these things that are going to contribute to this continuum of fitness and fatness? Physiological and physical stresses, nutrition balance, genetic regulators, environmental influences, social influences are all going to come into play. And they're going to come into play in such a way that they're going to influence each other. Where we have environmental influences, familial influences that are going to change social factors. We have genetic influences and hormonal influences that are going to change physiological factors. Physiological factors and social factors are going to change body morphology and change health behaviors. All this is going to lead to changes in overall health. What the GLP-1 agonists do and what a lot of the mimic drugs do is it focuses solely on that hormonal influential factor, that one cog in all of these cogs, without having changes to the other cogs themselves. Once that cog's influence starts to slow down or starts to change, we start to lose its influence, which is why when we go back and look at the studies that examined what happens when I go for long duration on the GLP-1 agonists and then cut it. What happens to weight loss? What happens to all the benefits? They get lost. Yes, there is some relative difference that we see with the placebo groups, but without having these necessary changes, we're not going to see long-term success coming about. So, if we start looking at this idea of can we get benefit from the pills? Can we get weight loss from the pills? Why is it that everybody's not responding the same way? We come back to the fact that physiologically everything's going to vary. And because everything's going to vary, we have to be very careful making these big gross generalizations. There's a plateau effect, and this plateau effect is real. And we have to be very cognizant of this plateau effect, and we have to change how we do things in an 8 to 12 week window of time. So one of the things that we showed in a meta-analytical study is that you start to get peak effectiveness between 8 and 12 weeks, and you start to plateau that peak effectiveness at between 12 and 24 weeks. That was one of the graphs that I showed early on. That plateau effect means that we have to change how we do things in order to get continuous progression. We're going to reach a plateau and we're going to stay in a plateau. And so when we start having this periodized approach, such as what we did here with our exercisers that had very minimal changes in diet, all we did was change some of the macro comparisons. But what we saw is we saw continuous and progressive weight loss. Yes, the percentage started to drop as we continued out, but we continued to see a reduction in body mass. We started to see a reduction in fat mass that started to drop, that started to increase, that started to drop, started to increase. The change that we see in terms of fat mass is about what we're doing within the exercise. And that change in what we're doing in exercise causing changes in the relative load of fat mass. But the thing that we saw is an always positive change in fat-free mass. And that is key here because it's not just about weight. That's the biggest misconception that we start looking at what these drugs are trying to do and what they're being marketed as. It's not about weight. It's about body composition. It's about recompositioning the body so that we get the benefit that we can get from maintaining fat-free mass or gaining fat-free mass, and the benefit that we can get from reducing fat mass. Fat mass has a deleterious effect, has a negative effect on our overall health by triggering cells within the fat cells, within the adipose tissue of the body, to start to inflame the body, to start to cause oxidative stress, to start to cause chronic inflammation to set in. That leads to all of the metabolic issues that we are trying to offset through the use of these medications. While we do see benefit coming from these medications, we see continuous progressive benefits coming from the inclusion of resistance exercise more than any of the other forms of exercise that's there. We must address the fact that it's about body composition issues, not about weight. Once again, the scale simply tells me how much mass is there. It doesn't tell me what is the health effect of those masses. Long-term effects are only going to be progressive if the stress is not constant. And that's where we have to go back and continue to look at. the periodization of exercise, the periodization of diet, and the periodization of pharmacological agents. If we want to make sure that the drugs continue to work, we have to make sure that we are periodizing how we go about utilizing those drugs. We have to make sure that we're not getting excessive amounts of upregulation, excessive amounts of downregulation, or any changes in levels of sensitivity to the natural occurring hormones and to the drugs in terms of the responsiveness that those drugs might have to the naturally occurring hormones. The other thing we have to look at in terms of these long-term effects and then want to have them be progressive is that we have to remember those plateauing effects that take place. The 8 to 12 weeks where we have to start to modify what we're doing. And this is where within the periodization, we have to make sure that we are following our goal-oriented periodized program, setting out our microcycles, our mesocycles, and our macrocycles, not solely off of weight, which is one of the things that we saw within our yo-yo study. That's the study that we looked at just a couple seconds ago in terms of the minimizing the plateau effect. We don't look at weight as one of the measurements, even though weight might be the long-term goal. What we do is we look at all of the other physiological measures, all the other performance measures. Side effects and adverse events make it less likely to continue. If we look at all of the reports that we hear about as relates to the Ozempic, as relates to the semaglutamides, we hear things about having oral health issues. We hear things about having cosmetic issues. We hear things about having neurological issues. We hear things about having pancreatic issues. All of these side effects and these stories about side effects make it less likely for someone to start the drug treatment and less likely to continue the drug treatment. And so, if we're looking at utilizing the drugs as a benefit within the idea of making these fitness and fatness changes, we have to be cognizant of what might these drugs do that lead to a discontinuance of the drugs based off of the relative negativity that we see. Here are just some of the common side effects as relates to just gastrointestinal distress, vomiting, nausea, diarrhea. But that doesn't include other things that have been reported that we see within the news, such as the quote unquote brain fog, such as changes in terms of gingiva, gums within the mouth, dry mouth issues, the gaughtness that people report within their face, the gaughtness within the face, the reduction of fat mass in and around the cheeks that make someone look less appealing, the changes that we can see within pancreatic functions based off of the alterations in feedback that can come from the GLP-1 agonists and their effect metabolically. This is where we have to be cognizant and be aware of what the medicines are intended to do. And the medicines are intended to help people regulate diabetic conditions. The side effect to regulating those diabetic conditions was weight loss. And because the side effect was weight loss, yes, it's a beneficial side effect, but because it was a side effect, and we use that side effect as the kind of rationale for let's use these drugs because we have this weight epidemic going on, or this weight pandemic going on in terms of ever increasing body size. Well, we have a drug because people want drugs in order to alleviate issues. The side effect of a drug causing the effect on something else doesn't necessarily make it completely safe and effective for that something else. And that's where we have to look at what is occurring within those issues as kind of a caveat on how well we actually want to utilize those drugs and whether or not we actually want to utilize those drugs. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Hopefully, got a bit out of the conversation relates to the GLP-1 agonists and whether they work or not work and what we can take home from them. There's going to be a much longer discussion on the podcast where I'm going to pull in the other episodes that we've previously recorded and make it into a long discussion on the weight loss and the pills and the GLP-1 agonists. If you have questions, please make sure you leave them for us. We're more than happy to talk about it. Please make sure you're following us on the YouTube, on the podcast, written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes on Instagram and on Threads.